quiet drive to the coast. The evening arrived the way all the best evenings arrive. Not with any grand announcement, not with a sudden dropping of light or a sharp change in the air, but slowly, gently, the way a tide comes in when no one is watching. One moment, the sky held the last warm gold of the afternoon, and the next, almost without anyone noticing, that gold had softened into something quieter, a pale, milky lavender that stretched from one end of the horizon to the other, touching the tops of the hedgerows, resting on the surface of the fields, settling over the whole of the northern Irish coast like a soft, clean cloth laid over something precious. It was in this light that Alina stepped out of the little stone cottage she had rented for the week. She paused in the doorway for a moment, one hand resting lightly on the old wooden frame, and simply breathed. In through the nose, slow, full, all the way down to the bottom of her lungs. Out through the mouth, long, unhurried, like a sigh that had been waiting all day to finally be released. The air outside was cool and faintly damp, carrying within it the particular freshness of a place that exists far from cities, far from engines, far from the low, constant hum of modern life. It smelled of earth and grass and something else, something she could not quite name but recognized immediately. It was the smell of quiet. She pulled the cottage door closed behind her, gently, as though not to disturb whatever peace had already gathered there. She wore a soft gray jumper over a loose linen shirt, dark trousers that had been washed so many times they had taken on the feel of something lived in, comfortable, familiar. Around her neck, loosely folded, was a woolen scarf the color of old heather, a muted, dusty purple that seemed to belong to this landscape the way certain colors belong to certain places, as though the land itself had chosen them. Her car sat in the small gravel pull-in beside the cottage wall, a low, modest thing, not new, the kind of car that is driven not to be seen, but simply to go somewhere. She moved toward it without hurry, her boots making soft, unhurried sounds against the wet gravel, and she unlocked it and sat inside without turning the engine on, just for a moment, just to sit, just to look out through the windscreen at the lane ahead of her, narrow and green and fading into the growing dusk. There is something about sitting in a parked car in a quiet place that is unlike sitting anywhere else. The car becomes, for a moment, a kind of held space, enclosed, private, with the world held gently at a distance by the glass around you. Alina sat in that held space and let her thoughts settle the way fine dust settles in a room after a long day, drifting slowly downward, coming to rest on whatever surfaces were nearest. She thought briefly about the week she had left behind, the meetings, the emails, the noise of the office, the way one day had pressed into the next without any particular gap between them. And then, quite deliberately, she let those thoughts drift further. She watched them the way you might watch a leaf moving downstream with interest, but without the need to follow. She started the engine. It turned over softly. She pulled out of the gravel pull-in and onto the lane that wound from her cottage toward the coast was the kind of road that could not be hurried. Not because of its narrowness, though it was narrow, barely wide enough for two small cars to pass each other without one of them pulling in to wait, but because of the way it moved. It did not go straight. It did not take the efficient route from one point to another, the way roads built for commerce and speed tend to do. Instead, it curved and dipped and rose again, following the shape of the land, the way water follows the land, taking the path that the land itself had suggested over centuries of feet and wheels and seasons. Elinor drove at a pace that matched the lane, slow, attentive, her hands resting lightly on the wheel, not gripping, just guiding. The headlights were not yet on. There was still enough of the evening light to see by, that gentle, sourceless gray-blue that arrives after the sun has gone, but before the true dark has settled. In this light, the hedgerows on either side of the lane looked almost luminous, their green so deep, and saturated it seemed to hold some light of its own, the way certain old stones hold the warmth of the afternoon sun long after the afternoon has passed. Hedgerows were thick and abundant. They crowded close to either side of the lane, so close that in places the long, trailing ends of branches reached out and brushed the side mirrors of her car. A soft, whispering touch, like a hand trailing along a surface without quite pressing down. Within the hedgerows, she could hear she imagined she could hear, or perhaps she actually could. The line between hearing and imagining is finer than people suppose. The small, brief sounds of birds settling in for the night. A rustle here, a single liquid note there. The quick, dry percussion of wings folding against a body. Then stillness again. She drove past a low stone wall that ran along the right side of the lane for perhaps 100 yards. The wall was old, very old, the kind of wall assembled without mortar. Stone laid upon stone by hands that understood the weight and angle of each piece. It was covered along its upper surface in a thick, soft moss of the deepest gray-green. And in the crevices between the stones grew tiny things, small ferns, thin threads of vine, pale cushions of lichen that had perhaps been growing there undisturbed for decades. She slowed even further as she passed it, not for any reason she could have named, only because there was something about the wall that asked to be noticed slowly. The lane turned, and the wall was behind her. A little further on, she passed a field. It lay to her left, separated from the lane by a low wooden gate that had at some point been painted white and had since faded to the color of old bone. The field itself was large and gently sloping, its grass a dark, soft green in the evening light, and in the middle of it, standing very still, were two horses. They were not doing anything, as horses sometimes do nothing with a completeness that other creatures rarely manage. They simply stood, side by side, their heads slightly lowered, their bodies utterly motionless, except for the faintest movement of their tails in a breeze Alina could not herself feel from inside the car. Their eyes were closed, or perhaps not quite closed. It was difficult to tell in this light, and they gave the impression of animals so deeply at rest that they had crossed some invisible border into a place where the waking world could not quite reach them. Alina brought the car almost to a stop and looked at them. There was something she always found deeply calming about horses at rest. Something about the sheer physical weight of them, those vast, patient bodies, those legs like pillars, that enormous calm, and the way that weight rested so completely on the earth beneath them. They were not restless. They were not uncertain. They had placed their full weight on the ground, and the ground had received it without complaint, and that was enough. They were simply there, in the way that very old things are simply there. The hills, the walls, the sea. She sat with them for a few seconds longer than was necessary. Then she drove on. The light was thinning now, gradually, without urgency. The lavender of the earlier sky had deepened towards something closer to indigo at its zenith, while near the horizon, in the direction she was driving, the direction of the sea, there remained a faint, luminous strip of lighter color, the sky's last acknowledgement of the day that had been. Not quite pink, not quite white, something between the two, like the inside of a shell held up to light. She rolled the window down a little on her side, not all the way, just a few inches, enough to let the air move through the gap. It came in cool and unhurried, pressing lightly against her cheek, lifting a few strands of her hair, carrying with it all the particular fragrances of this particular evening on this particular stretch of the Irish coast. There was the deep, composting sweetness of the hedgerows, all that green life in its endless cycle of growth and decay. There was the mineral coldness of recent rain on stone. There was the faint, far-off sweetness of cut hay from somewhere across the fields. And beneath all of it, threading through everything, faint but unmistakable now, the ocean. It was not a strong smell yet. It was not the full, bold, salt-saturated air of the cliff's edge. It was only a hint, a suggestion, the ocean announcing itself from a distance. The way certain pieces of music begin so quietly that you are not sure at first whether you are hearing them or imagining them. But it was there. She was certain of it. A coolness within the coolness, a cleanness within the clean air, something ancient and enormous at the end of this winding lane. She breathed it in and felt something inside her chest. Somewhere below the throat and above the stomach soften further along, where the lane crested a low rise and then descended again into a shallow valley before rising once more toward the coast. She passed a farmhouse. It sat set back from the road, perhaps 50 yards distant, behind a rough gravel yard in which an old tractor was parked, and several flower pots stood in a line along the base of the wall. The house itself was low and solid, with white rendered walls that had gone slightly gray with age and weather, a slate roof, a chimney from which a thin thread of smoke rose in a perfectly straight line into the still air, and a single window on the ground floor in which a lamp glowed, not brightly, not the blue-white light of screens or energy-saving bulbs, but warm amber, the color of something burning slowly and contentedly, the color of a room in which someone has made themselves comfortable for the evening. Alina looked at that lit window as she drove past. There was something in the sight of a warm, lit window seen from outside, and from a moving vehicle that always moved her. The sense of a life contained, small and warm, and entirely sufficient unto itself. Someone inside that room who had no idea she was passing, who was perhaps sitting in a chair near that lamp, reading or knitting, or simply sitting with a cup of tea and the comfortable blankness of an evening that asked nothing of them. The smoke from the chimney moved upward in a perfect thin column, and then, very gradually, dispersed into the air above the house, becoming indistinguishable from the sky. She drove past the farmhouse, and the lane curved right, and the farmhouse was gone from her mirrors, and there was only the lane ahead of her again, and the hedgerows, and the evening air coming through the gap in the window. The lane climbed slightly, running between two fields of rough grazing land, now rather than hedgerows, and as it climbed, the strip of lighter sky at the horizon grew more visible, broader, more fully present. She could feel the sea before she could see it, a change in the air, a slight increase in the coolness, a freshening, as though the atmosphere itself were being refreshed by proximity to all that moving water. Her window was down a little further now. She had lowered it unconsciously, pulled by some instinct toward more of that air. And then the lane made one final curve, a long, sweeping left turn that brought the car around and aimed it directly at the coast. And she saw it. The sea. It lay at the end of the view, perhaps a mile distant, dark and wide and immense beneath the remains of the evening sky. From this distance, it was almost perfectly still. Or rather, it moved in ways too subtle to be perceived from a mile away, its surface appearing from this vantage point like a great dark plain, featureless and immense, going on beyond the horizon into a darkness that had no particular end. The strip of lighter sky above it was reflected in it, faintly, imperfectly, the way a candle is reflected in a dark window. so that the boundary between sea and sky was, for a moment, unclear, the two darknesses merging into each other somewhere in the middle distance in a way that made the world seem larger than usual, more continuous, less divided. Elinor slowed the car almost to a stop on the slight rise and sat with that view for a long moment. There are sights that settle the mind simply by being looked at, not because they are spectacular, though this was, in its quiet way, spectacular, but because of the scale of their patience. The sea had been there in the darkness long before she arrived, and would be there long after she had gone. And in that uncountable duration, there was something that the mind, presented with it, could not help but absorb. A sense of proportion, a sense of context, a sense that the things which had seemed pressing and large a few hours ago were measured against that dark water and that darkening sky, something considerably smaller than they had appeared. She sat with it for 30 seconds, perhaps a minute. Then she drove on down the hill toward the coast. The small gravel car park at the foot of the coastal path was empty except for one other vehicle, a dark green van with mud on its lower panels, and a bumper sticker she could not read in this light. She pulled in slowly, listening to the crunch of the stones beneath her tires, which was a satisfying sound, a grounded, material sound, the sound of arrival. She turned off the engine. Silence, not complete silence. There is no complete silence near the sea, but the particular silence of a quiet coastal evening, the distant sound of the water, low and unceasing, present in the background, the way a heartbeat is present in the body without being consciously heard. The wind, very slight, moving through the long coastal grass at the edge of the car park with a soft, continuous sound like the turning of pages. The tick of her cooling engine, and beneath all of it, so constant and so steady that it was less a sound and more a quality of the air itself, the sea. She sat in the car for a moment with the engine off, as she often sat before leaving a car, not because there was anything to wait for, but because the moment of transition, from motion to stillness, from the contained world of the car to the open world outside, was a moment worth experiencing rather than rushing past. She rested her hands in her lap. She looked out through the windscreen at the coastal path leading away from the car park toward the cliffs. A pale ribbon of dirt between dark grass under the last of the evening sky. Then she opened the door and stepped out. The air came at her immediately, full and cold and alive, entirely different from the air inside the car. It moved against her face and hands with a gentle, unhurrying pressure. She reached into the back seat for her scarf and wound it loosely around her neck, tucking the ends into her collar, and stood for a moment with her hands in her pockets, adjusting to the openness of the outside. After the enclosed warmth of the car, the world felt briefly enormous. The sky above her was now properly dark in its upper reaches, with the first stars beginning to assert themselves, pale, tentative, not yet fully committed to the dark, but present. The horizon to the west still held that faint, diminishing glow, less a color now than a quality, an afterthought of light. She took one long, full breath of the sea air. It filled her completely, lungs, chest, all the spaces between things. She held it for a moment. Then she let it go, and she began to walk. Her footsteps on the gravel were soft and slow. At the edge of the car park, the path began compacted earth, slightly damp, edged on both sides by coastal grass that moved in the evening breeze with a sound like breathing. The path climbed gently ahead of her, curving away toward the cliff's edge. And beyond it, though she could not yet see it, she knew the island was waiting, small and green and patient, resting on the dark water, as it had always rested, as it would always rest, surrounded by the sea on every side, perfectly still, perfectly at peace. She walked toward it, slowly, without hurry, letting the sound of the sea grow fuller with every step, letting the cool air move through her hair, letting the thoughts that had followed her here from the city loosen their hold. One by one, the way a hand loosens its grip on something it no longer needs to hold. The path curved ahead. The stars grew brighter above her. The sea breathed in the dark below the cliffs, and Alina walked on into the quiet. At the end of the long, good day, breathe slowly. The sea is close now. Close your eyes and let the sound carry you. Arriving at the cliffs, the path from the car park to the cliffs was not a long one, measured in distance. A person walking briskly might have covered it in 10 minutes, perhaps less. But Alina was not walking briskly. She was walking the way the evening deserved to be walked through, slowly, attentively, with her hands loose at her sides and her face turned slightly upward, the way a person turns their face upward when they want to receive something the sky is offering. She had no phone in her hand, no earphones in her ears, nothing between herself and the world around her except the soft wool of her scarf and the slight, pleasant weight of her jacket on her shoulders. This was deliberate. She had made the decision before leaving the cottage, a quiet, private decision, the kind that requires no announcement, that this evening would be given entirely to the place she was in, not to the documentation of the place, not to the sharing of it, simply to the being there. The path was narrow and gently uneven underfoot, the kind of surface that asks you to pay attention to where you step without demanding so much attention that you cannot also look up and look around. It was compacted earth for the most part, with occasional patches of fine gravel, and here and there, flat stones laid across wetter sections where the ground dipped and held water after rain. The grass on either side grew tall and loose, the particular coastal grass that is thinner and more yielding than inland grass, that bends in the lightest wind and rights itself again without effort, over and over, all day long, all night long, without pause or complaint. As she walked, the sounds around her shifted and deepened. The sound of the car park gravel, the occasional distant rumble of a vehicle on the road above, fell away behind her, and in its place came something fuller, something that was not quite a sound in the ordinary sense, but rather a presence. The sea, not yet visible, not yet close enough for the individual sounds within it, the particular slap of water on rock, the hiss of foam retreating across stone to be distinguished. But there, always there, beneath and behind and around everything else, like the bass note that runs under a piece of music and gives all the other sounds their weight and meaning. She walked toward it. The path climbed, gently at first, and then a little more purposefully, rising toward the higher ground of the headland where the cliffs began. On either side the land opened out, the hedgerows giving way to low coastal scrub, heather and gorse mostly, their shapes rounded and low against the sky, their colors difficult to read in the fading light, but present nonetheless. The dark olive green of heather and the deeper, denser green of gorse with here and there, even now, a single late flower of brilliant yellow, stubborn and bright, holding on to the season a little longer than the rest. The sky above her had shifted during her walk from the car park. The last of the lingering brightness at the western horizon had finally surrendered to the dark, and the whole sky was now a deep, uniform blue-gray, not black yet, not the true dark of full night, but approaching it, leaning into it the way the evening always leans eventually into night. The stars were more confident now, more fully present. She could see them clearly in the upper half of the sky, not a great multitude yet, but enough to make the sky feel inhabited, populated with its own ancient, unhurried life, going about its business at a remove from anything she might be thinking or doing. She stopped once on the climb and turned to look back the way she had come. The car park was invisible now, swallowed by the curve of the path and the low, dark shapes of the scrub. Behind it, far away across the fields she had driven through, she could see, or imagined she could see, a single tiny point of warm light. The farmhouse, the lamp in the window, still burning, still warm, holding its small, sufficient world intact against the coming dark. She looked at it for a moment, that distant point of light, and felt something she could not have named precisely. A kind of tenderness, perhaps, for the smallness and the warmth of it, out there in all that dark and quiet. Then she turned back toward the sea and walked on. The path leveled out as it reached the headland, and the character of the air changed. She felt it before she fully understood it. a sudden increase in the pressure of the wind against her face, a freshening, a sense of more space around her, as though the world had widened, which it had. The low scrub on either side dropped away, and she was walking now across open clifftop, short, wind-flattened grass, pale and fine, with bare patches of dark rock showing through. The ground here felt different beneath her feet, harder, more exposed, more directly connected to the rock beneath. Less insulated by centuries of accumulated earth and growth. More honest, perhaps, more itself. And then she heard it properly for the first time. The sea, not the background murmur of it that had been accompanying her since she left the car. This was the sea as it truly was at close range. A low, enormous, rhythmic breathing. Each swell that moved beneath the cliffs rose and fell with a sound like a great, slow exhale, deep and resonant, and perfectly regular, the way a sleeping person breathes when they are deeply, completely asleep. Not crashing, not violent. The evening was calm enough, and the cliffs sheltered enough that the water moved without fury, without drama, with only that immense, patient, repetitive breath. She slowed her steps even further. There is a moment approaching the sea from land when the ratio between what you can hear and what you can see shifts, when the sound of the water becomes larger than your view of it, when you know it is there in its full enormity before you have yet seen it. This was that moment. She could hear the sea all around her, coming up from below and from ahead, and even carried by the wind from slightly behind. And yet she had not yet reached the edge, not yet seen down into the dark water where the cliffs fell away. She walked the last few yards toward the cliff's edge with a kind of care, not out of fear, but out of respect. The way you approach something very large or very old with a slight adjustment of your bearing, a slight lowering of your speed, an unconscious acknowledgement that you are entering the presence of something that has nothing to prove. She stopped at the edge. Below her, the cliffs fell, not dramatically, not with the sheer vertiginous drop of some coastal edges. These were deep, solid, immovable, formed from the same dark basalt columns that characterized so much of this stretch of the Antrim coast, hexagonal and close-fitted, standing upright in their thousands, like the pipes of some organ built at the very beginning of things. They dropped perhaps 30 meters, perhaps more, to the water below, and they did so with a completeness, a sense of finality that was not frightening, but simply true. The land ended here. The sea began. There was no negotiation between them, no gradual transition. Just the clean, absolute fact of the edge. The water below moved in the dark. It was not visible in any detail. The light was too far gone for that, and the water was dark with depth and evening shadow. But she could see the broad, slow movement of the swells as they came in from the open sea, and passed beneath the cliffs, a rising and a falling of the whole dark surface, so gradual and so vast that it was less like watching water and more like watching something breathe. The swells were long and unhurried. They came from a great distance, from far out in the Atlantic, beyond the last of the islands, beyond the reach of any shore. And they carried within them the memory of all that open water, all that unobstructed passage, arriving here at last at this cliff's edge, and releasing themselves against the rock with that long, slow, satisfied sound. Aline stood at the edge and listened. She was not thinking about anything in particular. This is the particular gift of a sound like the sea, heard at close range in a quiet evening. It fills the mind so completely, so gently, that there is no room left for the ordinary traffic of thought. Not that the thoughts are pushed out or suppressed, more that they are covered over, the way snow covers a busy street, softening the edges, muffling the movement, leaving only the large, simple shapes of things. She stood there for a long time. To her right, further along the clifftop path, she could see the faint outline of the rope bridge platform, the structure from which the bridge extended out across the gap to the island. She could not see the bridge itself from here, only its approach, a low, solid viewing area built from timber and stone, partially visible against the slightly lighter strip of sky above the horizon. Beyond it, barely discernible in the dimness, the gap itself, 20 or 30 meters of moving water between the mainland cliff and the island. And beyond the gap, the island, Carrick-a-Rede. Even in this light, even at this distance, even with the details of it swallowed by the evening dark, the island had a presence, a specificity. It was not merely a dark shape on the water. It was a place, a small, bounded, particular place, defined on all sides by the sea that surrounded it, held in its position in the world with a quiet certainty that Aline found, standing on the cliff's edge looking at it, deeply and inexplicably moving. It was small. She knew this. She had looked it up before coming, a tiny outcrop of land, barely more than a rocky headland detached from the mainland by centuries of water and erosion. You could walk its length in minutes. There was no shelter on it beyond a few low stone walls built in the old salmon fishing days. No trees, nothing of human habitation remaining except the memory of what had once been there. It was, by any practical measure, nothing much. And yet, there was something about the island, its smallness perhaps, or its completeness, the way it sat fully itself in the middle of all that dark water, that made Aline feel something she would not have been able to articulate, but that settled in her chest like a warm stone. The word that kept presenting itself, unbidden, was the word safe. Not in the sense of protected or defended, in the deeper sense of something that knows exactly what and where it is, and has no need to be otherwise. She breathed in. She breathed out. The sea went on breathing below her. The wind on the clifftop was gentle but constant, the kind of wind that does not gust or vary, but simply blows steadily and without drama off the open water. It moved through Aliner's hair and pressed lightly against her face, and found its way through the small gaps in her jacket collar in a way that was far from unpleasant, actually rather welcome, cool, without being cold, persistent, without being insistent, carrying within it the full, unfiltered smell of the open sea. That smell, she had grown up nowhere near the ocean. Her childhood had been inland. The smells of her early years were of cut grass and car exhaust, and the particular mustiness of old books and the wood smoke of autumn. All perfectly good smells, all still dear to her in their way. But the smell of the sea was something she had encountered only in adulthood, and it had hit her with the force of something already known and loved, as though some part of her had been waiting for it, as though the recognition had preceded the acquaintance. Salt and iodine, and something mineral and ancient, the smell of depth and distance, and everything the water had touched in its long, unceasing movement across the face of the earth. She pulled it into her lungs deliberately now, standing on the clifftop in the almost dark, eyes half closed, scarf lifted by the wind from her collar, and moving gently behind her shoulder. She breathed it in the way you breathe in the smell of something wonderful that you are not sure you will encounter again soon. With attention, with gratitude, with a slight ache of pleasure. Then she let it go and breathed in again. Further along the path, at the far end of the clifftop platform near the bridge, she could see a single figure. A man, she thought, though in the dark, and at this distance she was guessing. He stood at the railing that bordered the platform, looking out toward the island, very still, his hands in his pockets, his dark jacket barely distinguishable from the dark of the sky behind him. He was not looking at her. He was not looking at anything except the island and the water and the night. She found this companionable rather than intrusive. There is a specific kind of companionship that exists between strangers who share a quiet place, a wordless, undemanding kinship, based on nothing more than the fact of being in the same place, and presumably for the same unspoken reason: to be still for a moment, to be somewhere quiet, to set down whatever was being carried and simply be present in a place that rewarded presence. She began to walk slowly along the path toward the platform. The clifftop grass beneath her feet was damp and springy, and her footsteps made almost no sound. The wind moved in the grass around her with a continuous, soft, papery sound. The sea breathed below. The stars were brighter now. She could see the broad smear of the Milky Way, faint but present, arching across the sky above the island and the sea. That ancient light traveling such an incomprehensible distance to arrive here, to this clifftop, in this evening, and fall upon the backs of her hands and the dark water below. She stopped again and looked up at it, the Milky Way above the sea. There are very few sights that do to the chest what this particular combination does. The oldest light in the visible universe falling on the oldest movement on the Earth's surface, and in between them, for a moment, a single small figure on a cliff's edge, breathing, alive, present. She stood with her head tilted back and looked at it for a long time. When she reached the platform, the man she had seen from a distance was still there. Closer now, she could see he was older, perhaps 60, perhaps a little more, with a broad, weathered face and a dark green wax jacket that had clearly done long service in places like this. His hands were still in his pockets. His eyes were still on the island. He did not look at her as she came to stand at the railing a few feet from him, and she did not speak to him. They stood in easy, comfortable silence for several minutes. Below them, the water moved between the mainland and the island, a narrow channel, perhaps 20 meters wide, dark and muscular. The current within it, faintly visible even in this light as a slight disturbance on the surface, a subtle difference in the texture of the water. It was not turbulent. It was not dramatic, but it moved with a purpose and a power that the calmer water around it did not have. A reminder that the sea is not always and only the surface, that beneath the surface, always, there is movement and force and depth. The bridge was visible now, hanging in the near dark between the platform and the island, its thin wooden boards barely distinguishable in the dimness, the rope handrails pale against the dark air. In the very light wind, it moved very slightly, not swaying, not shaking, only the faintest, most gentle oscillation, a small sign of life in the bridge's long, patient waiting. Alina looked at it. She looked at the island beyond it, and she felt, standing at the railing in the cool night air, with the sea below her, and the stars above her, and the quiet man in the green jacket beside her, and the small, dark, certain island waiting on the far side of the bridge. She felt something very specific and very simple. She felt that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. This was a feeling she was familiar with, but which came rarely. It could not be manufactured. It could not be planned for or arranged. It arrived only in particular moments, in particular places, when some alignment of the outer and inner world occurred that was too precise to be accidental and too quiet to be dramatic. No trumpet, no revelation. Only this, a settling, a dropping into place, a sense of the world for a moment, being neither too large nor too small, neither too fast nor too slow, but exactly, precisely, perfectly the right size and the right speed for the person standing in it. She rested her hands on the railing. The metal was cool beneath her palms, damp with sea air. Below her, the water moved in its patient channel. The bridge waited. The island sat in its perfect smallness in the middle of all that dark, patient water. She did not need to move yet. There was no hurry. There was no schedule. There was only this, the cliff's edge, the sea air, the stars, the bridge, the island, and the enormous, quiet, unhurried breathing of the sea. She stayed. She breathed. The sea breathed back. And somewhere below the level of thought, somewhere in the quiet body, in the slowed heartbeat, in the loosened shoulders, in the easy, unhurried breath, something old and tired and long-held began. Very slowly, very gently, like a fist held tight for too long to open. The man in the green jacket shifted slightly beside her. He drew a slow breath through his nose. She heard it, a long, appreciative inhalation, almost like a sigh of contentment. And then he exhaled quietly. He said nothing. He had nothing to say. And she understood this perfectly, because she had nothing to say either. There was nothing that words could have added to what was already there. After a few more minutes, he straightened, took his hands from his pockets, rolled his shoulders once in the way that people do when they have been still for long enough, and turned from the railing. He walked back along the path the way Alina had come, his footsteps barely audible on the clifftop grass. And then he was gone, absorbed into the dark behind her. She was alone, alone at the cliff's edge, above the dark water, beneath the stars, in front of the bridge, before the island. She placed both hands on the railing and let the full weight of her forearms rest on it, leaning forward very slightly, face toward the island, toward the sea, toward the open, dark, breathing night. The wind moved through her hair. The stars held still. The sea went on. Abreast now. The cliffs are holding you. The stars are very close tonight. Breathe in the sea air and let everything go very slowly, very softly, down, crossing the rope bridge. Alina stood at the railing for a long time after the man in the green jacket had gone. There was no particular reason to move. The evening had not asked anything of her. The night was not pressing. There was no one waiting, no one expecting, no message that needed answering, no clock on the wall of any room she needed to return to. There was only the cliff top, and the air, and the sound of the sea below, and the bridge, and the island beyond the bridge, sitting in its small and perfect stillness on the dark water. She had no particular urgency about the crossing. She knew the bridge was there. She knew the island was there. She had come here for this, not in the sense of having a plan, but in the sense of having a direction, a pull, a quiet, unspoken intention that had begun forming somewhere around the time she had turned off the motorway and onto the country roads, and had been building steadily, gently, ever since, like water building behind a low dam. Not forcefully, simply accumulating. She breathed in, she breathed out. The bridge moved very slightly in the coastal wind, not dramatically, not with any sense of instability or threat, but with the small, living movement of something that is connected to the world around it and responds to that world honestly. The boards were barely visible in the dimness, each one a thin strip of dark wood suspended above the gap. The rope handrails curved gently on either side, pale in the low light, worn smooth along the top where thousands of hands had held them over many years, many seasons, many evenings, not unlike this one. She looked at the bridge for a while longer. Then she walked toward it. The approach to the bridge was a short path of compacted earth leading from the clifftop platform to the start of the crossing, bordered on either side by low wooden posts connected by a rope. A simple railing, more symbolic than practical, marking the way. The grass on either side of the path was short and wind-flattened, the kind of grass that has been shaped by years of salt air into something low and dense and almost carpet-like. In the dark, it was very soft underfoot, softer than she expected, and she slowed as she walked it, feeling the slight give of the ground beneath each step, the way the earth absorbed her weight quietly, without complaint. At the entrance to the bridge, she paused. She placed both hands on the rope handrails, one on each side, and felt the texture of them. The rope was thick and slightly rough against her palms, made from a fiber that had absorbed years of sea air and coastal weather, until it had become something partway between soft and hard, between yielding and firm. It was cool. It was damp in the particular way of things that are always near the sea, not wet, not dripping, but carrying a sustained, fine moisture within its fibers, the sea claiming it slowly, over time, incorporating it into itself. She wrapped her fingers around the handrails, and she stepped onto the first board. The bridge responded to her weight immediately, not dramatically, not with any alarming lurch or swing, but with a kind of acknowledgement, a small, gentle shift in its angle, a slight lowering in the center of the board she had stepped onto, a ripple of movement that traveled outward from beneath her foot along the whole length of the bridge, a slow, barely perceptible oscillation that moved from her feet upward through her legs and into her body like a very gentle pulse. She paused on that first board and let the bridge settle around her weight. There is something that happens when you step onto a rope bridge, something that happens in the body before the mind has quite caught up with it. A slight increase in awareness, a sharpening of attention, not fear necessarily, not for a leaner, not on this calm, still evening with the bridge solid and well maintained beneath her, but a kind of aliveness, a heightened presence. Every step becomes deliberate. Every shift of weight becomes conscious. You are here, and you are crossing, and the bridge is the only thing between you and the water below. And the bridge is holding you, and you are holding the bridge. And together, you are managing the crossing, each one relying on the other in a way that is entirely uncomplicated and completely honest. She liked this feeling. She took another step. The boards were perhaps 18 inches wide, laid with small gaps between them, gaps through which, if she looked down, she could see the dark water moving 30 meters below. She did not look down immediately. She looked ahead, toward the island, keeping her eyes on the far end of the bridge where the boards met solid ground again, where the dark outline of the island's rocky edge was just visible against the slightly lighter darkness of the sea behind it. But after a few more steps, she did look down. Through the gap between two boards, through the darkness, the water below was just visible, not in any detail, not with any clarity, but as a broad, moving darkness, darker than the rock around it, alive with the low, slow movement of the sea. It caught the faint light from the stars, barely, imperfectly, in brief, shifting fragments that appeared and disappeared as the swells moved beneath her. And in those fragments of reflected starlight, she could see the character of the water. Not violent, not rushing, simply moving, the way the sea always moves, with that deep, unhurried patience that belongs to things that have been moving for a very long time and expect to continue moving for a very long time more. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked up at the island again and continued walking. The center of the bridge was its most alive section. Here, furthest from both ends, the structure had the most freedom of movement, and Alina could feel this as she moved through it, the boards beneath her feet describing a very gentle arc of motion, with each step forward and back, side to side. The ropes vibrating faintly in the wind that moved through the gap with more directness here than it had on either clifftop. The wind in the gap between the mainland and the island had a particular quality. It moved with more purpose than the general coastal breeze, channeled and concentrated by the walls of rock on either side, so that it pressed against Alina's face and chest with a steady, gentle insistence, as though the gap itself were breathing. She stopped in the center. She was not supposed to stop on the bridge. The signs at the entrance had asked visitors to keep moving, to avoid lingering, to allow the crossing to flow. But she was alone on the bridge. There was no one behind her. There was no one ahead. There was only the bridge and the gap and the water and the stars. And she was in the middle of all of it, suspended between the mainland and the island, between where she had come from and where she was going. She let go of one of the handrails, just for a moment, just to feel what it was like to stand there with only one hand holding, the other hanging free at her side, the bridge moving very gently around and beneath her, the wind pressing at her face, the dark water below, the stars above, the island waiting ahead. It felt extraordinary, not dangerous, not reckless, simply extraordinary. The feeling of being in between, not on land, not in water, not anchored and not floating, but somewhere in the narrow, honest space between the two, held by a rope and a few old boards and nothing else. And finding that this was, for the moment, entirely sufficient, she took a slow, full breath of the gap wind, that channeled, purposeful air that tasted more fully of the sea than anything she had breathed yet, and held it for a moment in her lungs. Then she reached for the handrail again and walked on. With each step toward the island, the character of what she was moving toward changed. On the mainland side, the sound had been the broad, general breathing of the open sea, present on all sides, undifferentiated, immense. But here, approaching the island, the sound became more specific. She could hear the water moving against the base of the island's cliffs, a lower, more resonant sound than the general swell, the sound of water in conversation with a particular piece of rock, finding the hollows and the overhangs and the narrow channels, and moving through them with a low, patient, exploratory persistence. She could hear also the birds. She had not expected birds at this hour. But as she neared the island end of the bridge, she became aware of a sound beneath the wind and the water, a low, intermittent muttering, like a very large audience settling before a performance begins. The seabirds that nested in the crevices of the island's cliffs had not all retired for the night. Some were still shifting, still adjusting, still communicating in whatever brief, practical ways seabirds communicate with one another in the dark. She could not see them. They were invisible in the darkness below the cliff edge. But she could hear them, that low, communal sound, half drowsy, half alert, the sound of many small lives gathered close together in the dark, warm within the rock. It was a deeply comforting sound. She was still on the bridge when she first heard it, and she felt it affect her the way that certain sounds, rain on a roof, a distant train, the settling of an old house, affect the body. A softening, a slowing, a signal sent from the ears to everything below the neck that says, "This is safe. This is familiar. This is the world going about its ancient, undramatic business. You may rest." She took the last few steps of the bridge with that sound in her ears and stepped off onto the island's solid ground. The ground beneath her feet changed entirely as she left the last board and stepped onto the island. From the narrow, yielding surface of the bridge boards to something altogether more substantial, flat, dark rock, with a thin covering of close-cropped grass at its edges, cold and damp and utterly certain. She pressed both feet down onto it and felt the solid, immovable fact of it through the soles of her boots. The island, Carrick-a-Rede. She was on it. She stood still for a moment, adjusting. There is always a brief adjustment needed when crossing from one kind of ground to another, from soft to hard, from moving to still, from uncertain to solid. The body needs a moment to recalibrate, to reassess its relationship with what is beneath it, to release the particular alertness that was necessary on the bridge, and settle into the different kind of presence that solid ground invites. She stood with her feet slightly apart, her arms loose at her sides, and she felt the island beneath her. It was remarkable what a small piece of solid ground felt like after the bridge. Remarkable how completely, how immediately the body registered the difference. The stillness of the rock, the finality of it, the sense of something that would not move, that had not moved, that had been here in this form, this particular arrangement of basalt and grass and salt air, for an unimaginable length of time, and would continue to be here in roughly this form for an unimaginable length of time more. She exhaled. The island's surface near the bridge landing was mostly flat rock, dark and slightly glistening with moisture, with patches of low grass growing in the hollows and crevices where enough soil had accumulated to support it. The grass was very short, kept so by the wind and the salt air, which did not allow things to grow tall out here on the water, and it was very green, even in the darkness. The green of things that are fed by rain and sea mist and have no need of anything else. To her left, the island's land rose slightly toward its highest point. A low, rounded ridge of rock, perhaps 15 feet above sea level. Nothing dramatic, but enough to provide a clear view in all directions. To her right, the ground fell more steeply toward the water's edge, where the rock met the sea in a series of ledges and shelves, some submerged, some just above the waterline, each one dark and worn smooth by the constant movement of the water against them. She could hear the water on those lower ledges, a different sound from the open swell, more intimate, more specific. The water finding the contours of the rock, filling the shallow depressions on the incoming tide, retreating from them with a soft hiss on the outgoing. A sound like breathing, but breathing at the scale of the rock, intimate and specific. The sound of two very old things, water and stone, in their endless, patient, entirely unresentful negotiation. She turned toward the sound and walked slowly to the island's edge. The ledges near the waterline were not accessible. They were wet and steep, and in the dark, she would not have attempted them. But from the top of the first shelf of rock, perhaps 6 feet above the nearest ledge, she could see the water clearly. It moved against the island's base with a slow, dark energy, each swell lifting the surface slightly as it passed, the water rising along the rock face an inch or two, with each incoming wave before drawing back again, leaving the rock dark and shining. The foam, where it formed it all, was very pale in the low light, almost luminous briefly, before it collapsed and was drawn back into the dark. She sat down on the edge of the rock shelf. Not on a stone, not on a bench, not on anything prepared for sitting. Directly on the rock itself, the cold, slightly rough surface of the island pressing through her trousers, the dampness of it transferring slowly to the backs of her legs. It was not comfortable in any conventional sense. It was better than comfortable. It was direct. The cold rock and the damp air, and the sound of the water 3 feet below her feet. All of it completely unmediated, completely honest. The island presenting itself without softening or apology, and Alina receiving it in the same spirit. She rested her hands on the rock on either side of her, palms flat against the surface. She could feel the texture of it, the faint roughness of the basalt, the slight give of the thin crust of lichen covering parts of it, the cold that came from within the stone itself, radiating upward through her palms, the way cold always radiates from old rock, from deep within, from the earth's stored memory of every winter it has ever passed through. She sat with her hands on the rock, and the water moving below her, and the stars above, and the bridge behind her, and the mainland somewhere in the dark to her right. And she felt something she had not felt in a long time. She felt small, not diminished, not insignificant, but small in the way that is actually a relief, small in the correct proportion to the things around her. The island was small. The sea was enormous. The stars were beyond imagination. And she was a person, warm-blooded, breathing, temporary, sitting on a small rock in the middle of a large sea, beneath a sky full of ancient light. This was the correct arrangement. This was how things actually were, beneath all the noise and urgency of daily life. And sitting here, with the cold rock under her palms, and the dark water below, and the stars above, it was possible to feel this clearly, to hold it without any distress, to let it simply be true. Small was fine. Small was, in fact, wonderful. The seabirds below the cliff edge had grown quieter during the time she had been sitting on the rock. The intermittent muttering that had accompanied her across the bridge had subsided now to an occasional sound, a single brief note here, a rustle there, long silences in between. They were settling, tucking themselves further into the crevices of the rock, drawing warmth from the stone and from each other, going, in their uncomplicated way, to sleep. She listened to the silences between their sounds. The silences were not empty. They were full of the water and the wind, and the very faint, very high sound of the wind moving across the rock above her in a way that produced almost no sound at all. Just the suggestion of sound, the threshold of it. Full of the cold and the dark and the stars. Full of the island itself, which seemed to Alina, sitting on its edge in the near dark, to have a quality she could only describe as presence. Not the presence of something conscious or inhabited, of something complete, something that was entirely what it was, without remainder, without excess, without anything held back or left over. She had not brought a phone. She had not brought a book. She had not brought anything to do or look at or listen to except the island and the sea and the night around her. And she found, and this was, in its own quiet way, one of the finest discoveries she had made in some years, that this was enough, more than enough, that the island and the sea and the night and the cold rock under her hands and the slow dark swells below her feet and the stars above and the sound of the seabirds settling into their crevices and the wind moving in the gap between the island and the mainland, that all of this was, in fact, so much more than enough that the word enough did not quite cover it. It was full. She was full. After a long while, she became aware that the cold of the rock had moved fully into her hands and was beginning to move into her legs, and she shifted her weight and rubbed her palms together and stood up slowly, unfolding herself from the rock the way you unfold yourself from a position you have held for a long time, feeling the small protests and readjustments of the body as it returns to standing. She stood for a moment, hands in her jacket pockets, looking at the water. The sea moved below her in its long, patient swells. Each one came from far away and went nowhere in particular, simply moving, simply being the sea. In the faint light from the stars, the surface of each swell carried that brief, shifting glimmer she had noticed from the bridge, starlight on dark water. There and gone, like a thought that almost forms and then releases itself before it becomes anything definite. She watched it for another minute. Then she turned from the water and began to walk slowly along the island's edge, toward the higher ground of the interior, toward whatever was waiting there in the dark and the quiet. The bridge swayed very gently behind her in the coastal wind, patient and faithful, waiting for her return. The island received her steps in silence. The sea breathed on. You are on the island now. The water is all around you. The stars are very bright. There is nothing you need to do, nothing you need to be. Only here, only this, only the sound of the sea, slow and dark and endlessly patient, carrying you gently, carrying you softly, all the way down. Night comes to the water. The stars had deepened by the time Elinor opened her eyes. She had not slept, not quite. She had been in that country just beside sleep, that soft and borderless place where the body rests completely, and the mind releases its grip on the day without fully losing consciousness, where sounds arrive and are registered but not analyzed, where the cold of the rock beneath you becomes simply a fact, neither uncomfortable nor comfortable, simply present, simply part of the texture of being in a particular place at a particular time. She had been in that country for a while. She did not know how long. Time had loosened itself from its ordinary structure and simply flowed, the way water flows when there is no channel to direct it, in every direction at once, slowly, without urgency, finding the lowest and most natural path. She opened her eyes. The sky above her was darker than when she had closed them. The band of the Milky Way was more visible now. Or perhaps her eyes had grown more fully adjusted to the dark during the time she had spent with them closed, and it arched above her with a completeness and a brightness that made her breath catch very slightly. Not dramatically, not with surprise exactly, more with the feeling of being given something quietly and without announcement by the world. She lay still for another minute, simply looking upward. The stars did not move, not in any way she could perceive, not in any timescale her life allowed her to observe. They were simply there, as they had been there when she closed her eyes, as they had been there before she arrived, as they would be there after she left. The permanence of them was not cold or alienating. It was, in its own particular way, deeply companionable. They did not require anything of her. They did not judge the length of her stillness, or the quality of her rest, or the thoughts she had thought, or the thoughts she had released. They simply shone, steady and patient and ancient, on everything below them equally and without preference. She breathed in the night air. The cold had deepened while she had been still. It was not a dangerous cold, not the kind that demands action, that sends urgent signals from the extremities. It was the cold of a coastal evening in its later hours, settling into everything it touched with a quiet, thorough patience. The rock beneath her, the grass at the island's edges, the air moving over the water, and arriving at the island carrying the full, unfiltered temperature of the open Atlantic. It was the kind of cold that, once you accepted it rather than resisting it, became simply a quality of the air, like its saltiness or its movement. Present, honest, not unwelcome. She sat up slowly from the rock shelf, feeling the small adjustments the body makes after lying still for a long time, the slight stiffness in the shoulders, the awakening of the lower back, the return of sensation to the palms that had been resting on cold stone. She rolled her shoulders once, gently, and felt them settle into place. She drew her knees toward her chest for a moment and wrapped her arms around them, conserving warmth, and looked out from the island's highest point at the sea around her. The sea at this hour was something she had not quite prepared herself for, not because it was different from what she had already seen, the same dark surface, the same long swells, the same breathing, patient movement, but because the darkness had deepened enough now that the visual and the auditory had shifted in their proportions. What she could see had diminished, and what she could hear had grown, until the sound of the sea occupied a greater share of her awareness than the sight of it. The breathing of the water was everywhere. It came from all sides simultaneously, and it had a depth and a resonance at this hour, this late, quiet, deeply dark hour, that it had not quite had in the earlier evening, when there was still enough light to look at things, and the eyes were busy doing their work. Now the ears were doing their work, and the sound was immense. It was not a loud sound. She wanted to be clear about this, clear to herself, as she sat with her knees drawn up, and the cold settling around her and the stars above. It was not a loud sound. Volume was not the word. Magnitude was closer. Presence. The sound of the sea at night on all sides of a small island was something that filled the air completely. The way a large, slow, warm thing fills a room completely without pressing on anything. There was room for other sounds within it. The wind in the grass, the faint creak and whisper of the ropes on the bridge, the occasional brief sound of a bird shifting in the cliff crevices below. But these other sounds existed within the sound of the sea, the way small fish exist in a large body of water. The sea was the medium. Everything else moved through it. She listened. She did not try to separate the sounds, or analyze them, or identify their sources. She simply let the whole complex, layered texture of it arrive in her ears and pass through her, the way the cold passed through her clothing and reached her skin, the way the starlight fell on her face without asking permission. She let it be large. She let it be everywhere. She let it be, for the duration of this listening, the entire world. And something in her chest, in the very center of her, grew quiet in response to it. Not empty, not hollow. Quiet in the way that a deep pool is quiet, full of depth and stillness, with all the movement happening far below the surface, gentle and dark, and entirely unhurried. She stood up eventually, not because the sitting had become uncomfortable, not because there was somewhere she needed to be. She stood because standing felt right, felt like the next thing, the natural continuation of the evening, the way each moment of the evening had been the natural continuation of the moment before it. She stood and stretched her arms above her head, rising on the balls of her feet for a moment, feeling the full length of her body extending upward toward the stars. And then she let her arms fall back to her sides and stood simply, looking out at the sea. From standing, the view was different. The horizon was higher in her field of vision, the sea's surface more present, the sky reduced. She could see further in each direction. To the north, where the coast of the mainland curved away into the dark, there was a faint, distant pulsing of light, a lighthouse, she thought, its beams sweeping in its regular, patient circuit, appearing and disappearing with the slow, reliable rhythm of something mechanical and purposeful doing exactly what it was made to do. She watched it for a while, 1, 2, 3, gone. 1, 2, 3, gone. The lighthouse kept its count with a fidelity that was almost meditative. The same interval, the same duration, the same arc of light sweeping over the water and the dark air above it, and then retreating again into the dark. It had been doing this, or something like this, for however many years since it was first lit. It would go on doing it. Whatever happened on the mainland, whatever changed in the world, the lighthouse would go on with its counting, its patient illumination, its steady reassurance to anyone on the water that the coast was there, that the rocks were here, that the light was kept. She found the lighthouse deeply comforting. She found, in fact, almost everything about this island and this night, and this particular configuration of dark and water and light deeply comforting. And she stood on the island's highest point and let herself be comforted by it, without any self-consciousness about the word or the feeling, without any sense that she ought to be something other than a person who had come to a small island at night and stood in the dark and found it comforting. This was, she thought quietly, without making too much of it, exactly what she had needed. Not a plan or a strategy or a solution. Simply this: a small island, a dark sea, a lighthouse counting in the north, the world doing its quiet, unspectacular, essential work. She began to walk again, not purposefully. She had no particular destination on the island, no route she had planned, no feature she was seeking. She walked the way you walk when walking is itself the point, when each step is made simply because the ground is there, and the body wants to move through it slowly, with attention. She walked along the island's western edge, where the cliff dropped away toward the sea on her left, and the short, dark grass of the interior lay on her right. And she walked at the pace the evening seemed to want, very slow, very quiet, each footfall placed with care on the uneven surface, the island revealing itself to her step by step rather than all at once. The western edge of the island had a different quality from the northern cliff face she had sat above earlier. Here, the rock face was slightly lower and more complex in its structure. Not a clean drop to the water, but a series of shelves and outcroppings. The basalt columns that formed the base of the island, fracturing at different heights and angles, creating a broken, layered face of stone that the water had been working on for a very long time. The sound here was different too. The water moving against this more complex surface produced a more varied sound than the steady breathing of the open swell. There was more texture to it, more conversation, the water finding different hollows and angles, and producing from them different notes, a deep resonance in a wider hollow, a lighter, more frequent sound in a narrow crack, a slow, soft percussion where a flat shelf of rock received each incoming wave with a broad, unhurried slap, and then released it again in a long, retreating hiss. She walked slowly and listened to all of it. At one point along the western edge, she found a place where the ground came to a low, flat promontory. A tongue of rock projecting slightly from the island's main body, extending perhaps 6 feet out over the water. She stopped at its base and looked at it. The promontory was not safe to stand on in the dark. The surface was wet with spray, and she could see even from where she stood that its edges were irregular, unguarded, the drop to the water on either side immediate and certain. She did not step onto it, but she stood at its base, and she looked out along its length toward the open sea beyond it. And what she saw, or rather what she felt, standing there with the cold air pressing against her face and the sound of the water immediately below, was a sense of the island's edge that was more present, more physical, more immediate than anything she had felt from the higher ground. The edge was here, right here, 6 feet in front of her. The island ended. The rock stopped. The water began. Between the two, there was no gradation, no gentle slope, no easing of the transition. Only the abrupt, honest, absolute fact of the boundary. Land, sea. The difference between them as clear and as final as any line drawn in the world. She stood at this edge for a long time. There was something she wanted to understand about it, or rather, something she wanted to feel about it, since understanding seemed too small and too cerebral a word for what was being offered here. Something about endings, about boundaries, about the way certain things define themselves not by what they are, but by where they stop. The island was the island not because of the rock and the grass in its center, but because of this edge, this ending, this place where the land decided to be land no further, and the sea took over. She thought about her own life in these terms, about the edges of it, the places where she had decided to be one thing rather than another, the choices that had drawn her particular boundaries. She did not think about this with any anxiety or regret. She thought about it the way you think about geography when you are standing in it, with interest, with a certain objective appreciation, with the detachment that comes from being somewhere quiet and far from the consequences of your decisions. Then the thinking dissolved, as it always eventually dissolved out here, into the sound of the water and the cold of the air, and the simple, present fact of standing at the edge of a small island in the dark. She turned from the promontory and walked on. The southern end of the island was different again, lower and less dramatic than the northern and western edges. The rock here dropping to the water in a more gradual slope. The transition from island to sea gentler, more negotiated. There were rock pools here at the base of the slope. And even in the dark Aliner, could sense their presence, shallow depressions in the stone, filled with water that was stiller than the sea around them, protected by the rock from the movement of the swells, forming their own small, contained, entirely self-sufficient worlds in the hollows of the island's base. She could not see into them in the dark. She could not see the sea anemones and the small crabs and the periwinkles and the tiny fish that would be there, going about their small, cold, unhurried lives at the bottom of an inch of still water. But she knew they were there. She had read about the rock pools of Carrick-a-Rede, had seen photographs of them in daylight, all that color and life revealed in the shallow, clear water. And knowing they were there, even in the dark, even invisible to her, gave the island's base an additional quality of life, an additional sense of the island being not merely a rock in the sea, but a place, a home for many things, a meeting point of land and water, and all the creatures that live at that meeting point. She sat down on the slope above the rock pools and listened to the water around them, that quieter, more enclosed sound of a sheltered shore, the water moving without force, touching the rock gently, retreating gently, in no hurry to go anywhere or do anything except be the sea. The night had settled now into its full depth. There was no more gradation of light on the horizon. What had been the faint, diminishing afterglow of the evening had entirely surrendered to the dark. The sky was fully itself at last, the sky it had been building toward all evening, the sky it was when it was not lit from below or from the side by the remains of the sun. Fully dark, fully populated, the stars dense and various, and distributed from one horizon to the other with a generosity that still, even after hours of looking at them, filled her with something she could only describe as gratitude, not religious gratitude, not directed toward anything specific, simply the feeling, the physical, bodily feeling of gratitude for the experience of being alive in a world that contained this sky, this island, this sea, this night. Gratitude for having come here. Gratitude for the narrow lane and the farmhouse with the lit window and the horses standing still in the field and the cold rock and the rope bridge and the gannet on its ledge and the lighthouse counting in the north, and all of it, the whole unrepeatable, accidental, astonishing texture of this particular evening on this particular island. She sat with this feeling and did not try to make it into anything larger than it was. It was large enough. The cold had truly settled into her now, not painfully, but thoroughly. She could feel it in her fingers and in the tips of her ears and in the skin of her face, which had been exposed to the night air long enough that it no longer felt cold in the way it had at first, but had simply adjusted, had found a new baseline, had decided that this was now the temperature of things, and made its peace with it. She drew her jacket tighter around her and tucked her hands into her pockets. Her fingers found, in the left pocket, a smooth, flat stone, something she had picked up on a previous walk, days ago now, on a beach further along the coast. She had forgotten it was there. She closed her fingers around it and held it. It was cold, like everything else. But within a few moments of being held in her closed fist, it began to warm. The stone accepting the warmth of her hand and reflecting it back, until what had been cold was now simply the temperature of her own skin. And the stone felt not like something foreign in her hand, but like something that had been there always, smooth and oval and certain. She held it and looked at the sea, somewhere out on the water, far out, further than she could see, further than the island's edge or the mainland's coast, or any light she could perceive. There was a sound. She heard it first as a variation in the general texture of the sea's breathing, a slight change in the character of the sound, a new element woven into the familiar rhythm. She listened more carefully, turning her head slightly the way you turn your head when you are trying to locate a sound in the dark. And then it resolved itself. Not a wave, not a bird, not anything she had heard before on this island or this coast. A seal, a low, carrying sound, not quite a bark, not quite a call, traveling across the water from some point in the dark beyond her vision. It came once, and then again after a pause long enough that she had begun to think she had imagined it, and then again, 3 times in all. Then silence. She sat very still. The sound had been, she realized, exactly what the evening needed. Not a grand sound, not a dramatic sound, not a sound that demanded response or attention or interpretation. Simply a living sound arriving from the dark water, a reminder that the sea at night was not empty or still in the way that a room is still when it is empty, that it was inhabited, that it was full of life going about its life, that the dark water was home to things that did not need the light, and did not need the land, and did not need anything except the sea, and the depth, and the cold, and the vast, patient world of the ocean. The seal's sound faded. The sea went on breathing. She held the smooth stone in her closed fist and felt it warm against her palm, and listened to the silence where the sound had been. And the silence was, if anything, more beautiful for having been interrupted. She knew, without looking at any clock or checking any time, that the evening was moving now toward the hour when she would need to cross back over the bridge and walk back to the car and drive back along the narrow lane to the cottage. Not because anything was requiring her to. Not because she was expected anywhere or accountable to anyone for her time, but because the evening itself was signaling it. The deepened cold, the thoroughness of the dark, the completeness of the quiet, the way the island seemed to have given everything it had to give and was now simply resting, simply existing, simply being the island in the way that it was the island at all hours, whether anyone was on it or not. She sat for a few more minutes. She held the stone. She listened to the sea. The lighthouse in the north continued its patient counting. 1, 2, 3, and gone, and 1, 2, 3, and gone. And she counted with it once or twice, silently, her lips not moving, only her mind following the rhythm of it, and found that the counting was itself a kind of rest, a kind of surrender to the regularity of things, the predictability of a light that would come and go with the same interval at 3 in the morning as it did now, at midnight as it did at dawn, patient and reliable, and entirely unaware of being watched. She breathed in, 1, 2, 3. She breathed out, 1, 2, 3. The cold air filled her lungs and was warmed by them and left again. And somewhere in that exchange, in that simple, ancient, continuous transaction between the body and the air around it, the evening completed itself, not with a conclusion or a resolution, simply with a fullness, a roundedness, a sense of something having been received and held and settled into the body's memory, where it would remain long after the island was behind her, and the lane was ahead of her, and the cottage was waiting with its stone walls and its dark windows and its simple, sufficient warmth. She opened her fingers. She looked at the stone in her palm, oval, dark, smooth, for a moment. Then she closed her fingers around it again. She stood up slowly from the slope above the rock pools, feeling the cold in her legs as she straightened, brushing the damp from the back of her trousers with one hand. She turned toward the center of the island, toward the ridge, toward the bridge and the mainland beyond it. The island was quiet around her. The sea breathed on. The stars held still, and Alina began, slowly and without hurry, to make her way back. The night is very deep now. The sea is breathing all around you. The stars are holding still above you. The lighthouse is counting softly in the dark. 1, 2, 3, and gone. 1, 2, 3, and gone. Your breath is slow. Your body is warm. The stone in your hand is smooth and certain. Let your eyes close. Let the counting go. Let the sea carry the sound further and further, softer and softer, until there is only the breathing, only the dark, only the deep, warm, endless quiet of the night on the water. Rest now. Rest completely. You are safe. The island is here. The sea is here. And everything is still. The island at dusk. Alina walked slowly away from the water's edge, away from the ledges and the dark swells, and the faint, luminous fragments of starlight on the surface of the sea. And she moved deeper into the island's interior. If something so small could be said to have an interior at all. It could. That was the thing about Carrick-a-Rede, that she was only beginning to understand now that she was on it, now that her feet were on its ground and the bridge was behind her, and the mainland was an idea rather than a presence. The island had an inside, not in the architectural sense. There were no rooms, no corridors, no walls enclosing space against the weather, but in the older, more fundamental sense, the sense in which any piece of land surrounded by water on all sides has an inside simply by virtue of its boundedness, its completeness, the fact that it ends and the sea begins, and the line between the two is absolute. She was inside that boundary now. She was on the island, and the island was on the sea, and the sea was everywhere around her. And this triple layering of contained, within containing, within contained, was something the body understood before the mind found words for it. She felt it in her walking. She felt it in the particular quality of her footsteps on the short island grass, careful, appreciative, slightly reverent, the way you walk somewhere you have been allowed to enter and do not want to disturb. The grass underfoot was extraordinary. She had noticed it when she first stepped off the bridge, the greenness of it, even in the dark. But now, walking across it at a slow, exploratory pace, she became more fully aware of its texture and its character. It was nothing like the grass of lawns or playing fields or the careful, managed grass of parks. It was coastal grass, island grass, grass that had grown in this precise location, under the influence of this precise combination of forces. Salt wind, sea mist, Atlantic rain, thin rocky soil, and the complete absence of anything sheltering it from any direction. And it had become, over time, something entirely specific to those conditions, short, dense, tightly woven into itself, so low to the ground that in places it was more like a carpet than a covering, a living surface, green and slightly springy, pressed close to the rock beneath it, as though in an attitude of permanent, gentle submission to the wind that blew over it. Between the tufts of grass, in the small gaps and hollows, she could see the dark rock, the same black basalt that formed the cliffs and the ledges and the bridge foundations, the same volcanic stone that had been here since, before any human being had ever stood on this coast and looked out at the sea. She crouched down. She pressed the flat of her palm against the grass. It was cold and damp and alive beneath her hand. She could feel the resilience of it, the way the blades pressed gently back against her palm, and beneath them, through them, the hard, cold certainty of the rock below. She held her hand there for a moment, palm flat against the island's surface, feeling the cold rise through her skin and into her hand. And she thought, without words exactly, more as a feeling than a thought, how old this all was. How immeasurably, incalculably old. The rock, The grass adapted to the rock, the sea that had shaped the rock, the stars that had been there before the sea. She lifted her hand, stood slowly, and walked on. The highest point of the island was not high by any ordinary measure. Perhaps 15 feet, perhaps 20, above the general level of the surrounding rock. A low, broad ridge running roughly along the island's central axis, its upper surface bare in places and grass-covered in others, its edges dropping away on both sides toward the sea. But from the top of it, the view was complete in all directions. There was nothing blocking the sky, nothing narrowing the horizon. The sea went out from the island on every side, north, south, east, west, to a distance that, in daylight, would have been enormous, and that, in the dark of this evening, was simply the dark itself. The sea and the sky merging somewhere out there in the middle distance into a single, undifferentiated darkness through which the stars moved in their slow, patient arcs. She climbed toward this ridge. The climbing was nothing. A gentle slope of perhaps 30 feet of walking, the ground rising easily under her feet. But the effect of it at the top was immediate and complete. She turned slowly once, all the way around, taking in the full circle of the horizon. Water, in every direction water. Not rough water, not threatening water. The sea tonight was a dark, still, breathing surface, moving in its long, slow swells with that quality of patience she had been noticing all evening. The patience of something that has no reason to hurry, that has been doing what it does for so long that the doing has become indistinguishable from the being. The swells came and went. The surface rose and fell, and in the darkness, the line where the sea met the sky was a line of slightly greater softness. The two darknesses meeting without a sharp edge, blending into each other with the gradual, unhurried ease of things that have always been adjacent. She stood at the center of this circle and breathed. To the east, or what she believed was east, navigating by the position of the stars and the faint remaining glow at the western horizon, she could see the lights of a distant town, very small, very far, scattered along the coastline in an irregular line, the way lights are always scattered along coastlines, each one marking a house, a window, a life being lived at this hour in warmth and enclosure. From here, from the island, those lights were not intrusive. They were not reminders of the world she had left. They were simply beautiful. Small, warm points of light in all that dark, the way stars are small, warm points of light in all that deeper dark above them. Two layers of human and cosmic light held between the vast dark of the sea and the vast dark of the sky. She looked at the town lights for a while. She thought briefly and without any urgency of the people in those houses. Someone putting a kettle on. Someone reading in a chair by a window. Someone upstairs, perhaps, already in bed, already drifting toward sleep with the curtains closed and the room warm and the sound of the sea very distant, very faint, a background to their dreaming. She thought of these people with a tenderness that surprised her a little, a warmth toward strangers, toward the anonymous warmth of lit windows in the dark, toward the simple and recurring human miracle of a heated room at the end of a long day. Then she turned away from the lights and faced the open sea again. No lights there, nothing in that direction until she tried to remember the geography. Ireland fell away to the south and west, and then there was the open Atlantic, and then the far coast of another continent, too distant to imagine with any specificity. Just water, an incomprehensible amount of water, dark and cold and alive and patient and completely indifferent to her presence, which was perhaps the most restful thing about it. She liked being faced with things that were indifferent to her presence. It removed a certain pressure she had not fully noticed she was carrying. She found a place to sit near the island's highest point, a flat shelf of rock that jutted slightly from the ridge, its surface worn smooth on the upper side, dry enough despite the general dampness of the island's air. It was angled very slightly, like a reclining chair designed by geology rather than furniture makers. And when she sat on it and leaned back on her hands, she found that she was facing almost directly upward. The sky open above her, the stars filling her entire field of vision, the horizon visible only at the very edges of her peripheral sight. She leaned back. The sky above her was extraordinary. She had grown up with urban skis that were never truly dark, skis that glowed orange and amber from the light of the city beneath them, skis in which only the brightest planets and the most insistent stars could make themselves seen. She had known, in an abstract way, that the sky was fuller than this, that without the light pollution, without the constant low glow of human habitation, the sky above was dense with light that the city made invisible. She had known this, but knowing it had not prepared her for the reality of it. Out here on the island, on a clear evening, with the nearest significant town several miles distant, and the Atlantic stretching away in every direction, the sky was full, not metaphorically full, literally, materially full, packed with stars, dense with them, the familiar bright ones she could have named, surrounded by thousands and thousands of dimmer ones she had never seen before, and behind and between them, visible with the full dark-adapted eye, the broad, soft river of the Milky Way arching from one horizon to the other, a band of light so dense it had texture, so present it cast, or seemed to cast, the faintest, most unbelievable shadow. She lay back further on the rock shelf, so that her shoulders rested against it, her face fully upward, and she looked at it. There is a particular quality of attention that very large and very old things seem to require, or rather, seem to invite. Not the focused, directed attention of problem solving or analysis, but a softer, wider, more receptive kind of attention. The attention of letting the eyes go slightly unfocused and simply receiving what is there without nomming or categorizing or measuring. Children do this naturally. Adults do it rarely. Elinor did it now, lying back on the island's rock with the sea all around her and the stars above, letting her eyes soften and her mind follow. And she felt, as she did so, a progressive, gentle loosening of something that had been held tight for a long time. Not a dramatic release, not a crisis resolved or a weight removed, but a softening, a gradual unclenching, like a fist that has held something for so long it has forgotten that it is holding. The stars were old. This was a thought that rose in her and turned over slowly and then rested, unhurried. The stars were old. The light falling on her face right now, on her closed eyelids and her cheeks, and the backs of her hands resting on the rock, had left its source hundreds or thousands of years ago. Some of it had left before she was born. Some of it had left before the language she thought existed. Some of it had left before the island beneath her had been shaped by the sea. It had been traveling all that time through the dark, through the cold, through the unimaginable distance of space. And it had arrived here tonight, on this small island in the North Atlantic, and it was falling on her face. She lay still and let it fall. After a long while, she could not have said how long, time moved differently out here, or rather time moved at its actual pace, rather than the accelerated, compressed pace of a day full of tasks and obligations. She became aware of the cold again. Not painfully cold, not dangerously cold, just the consistent, democratic cold of a coastal night, settling into the fabric of her jacket and finding its way, eventually, to the skin beneath. She shifted her position on the rock shelf, drawing her knees slightly toward her chest, and looked around the island from her elevated position. The island was beautiful in the dark. She would not have predicted this, necessarily, had thought of it in the abstract as a place to see in daylight, to photograph in good light, to appreciate with the full visual apparatus. But in the dark, it was something different. In the dark, its smallness became more present, more intimate. The shapes of it, the rounded ridge of rock, the lower ground on either side, the irregular edge where the land met the sea, the patches of pale grass among the dark rock were visible as broad forms, broad shapes, and the simplicity of those shapes was itself a kind of beauty. Reduced to its essential geometry, the island was nothing but rock and grass and edge, the boundary between land and water drawn over and over in every direction, the sea defining the island as much as the island defined itself. She sat and looked at it from her small, elevated position. Her vantage point on the rock shelf allowed her to see across the island's full width in two directions, to the north and to the south. And in both directions, she could see the sea, could see the slight glimmer of the swells, could see the dark water moving against the island's edges. The island was surrounded. She was on it. The water went on in every direction to a distance that was, in the dark, effectively infinite. And she was peaceful, somewhere below the northern edge of the island. A gannet was sitting on a ledge of rock. She heard it before she saw it. Or rather, she heard the small, brief sound of its adjustment, the dry rasp of feathers against stone as it shifted its weight. And she turned toward the sound and looked down the slope from her rock shelf toward the northern cliff edge. And there, it was barely visible, a pale shape against the dark rock, sitting utterly still on a ledge perhaps 8 feet below the cliff top. She watched it. It did not move again. Whatever adjustment it had made was apparently sufficient, and now it sat with the complete, settled stillness of a bird that has decided the night is no longer something to be navigated, but something to be waited out. Its white feathers caught the faint starlight and held it, not reflecting it brightly, not gleaming, but simply being white in the darkness, which was its own kind of visibility, its own kind of presence. She watched the gannet for a long time. It did not look at her. It did not know she was there, or if it did, it had made the assessment and found her unthreatening and returned its attention to whatever birds attend to in the dark. Its eyes were not fully closed. She could see a faint gleam from here, a slight opening, but they were not active eyes. They were resting eyes, the eyes of a creature that is doing the great, essential, restorative work of simply existing without doing anything at all. She found the bird's stillness profoundly comforting. There was something about the gannet that crystallized what she had been feeling all evening, what the island had been offering her since she stepped off the bridge, in a way she had not yet been able to articulate. The gannet was not trying to be anything other than what it was. It was not performing, not striving, not arranging itself for any purpose other than its own rest. It had flown whatever distance it had flown during the day, far out over the open sea, she imagined, riding the wind with those long, angular wings, diving into the cold water for fish, doing all the energetic, purposeful, necessary things a gannet does in the light. And now it was done, and it had found its ledge, and it was still, and it was content, and the night was around it, and the sea was below it, and the stars were above it. And none of this required anything further from it. This was a leaner thought, or felt, rather, the thought arriving in the body before the mind. This was what the island was teaching. This was what all of it, the path, the cliffs, the bridge, the cold rock, the stars, the gannet, was saying, in its quiet, uninsistent way. "You can stop now. You are here. This is enough." She sat with this for a long time. The wind moved around her, gentle and continuous. The sea breathed below on all sides. The gannet sat on its ledge, white and still and entirely at peace. The stars went on above in their thousands, their light falling without preference on the rock and the water and the grass and the small figure of a woman sitting on a ledge on a small island in the North Atlantic, breathing, warm-blooded, alive, temporary, and yet, in this moment, feeling something that was very close to the opposite of temporary, feeling ancient, feeling continuous, feeling like a part of something much larger than her own life, connected to the rock and the water and the stars and the birds in the crevices of the cliffs, by nothing more elaborate than the simple fact of being present, being alive, being there. The feeling was not dramatic. It asked for no words. It arrived quietly and settled quietly and stayed quietly. The way all the best things settle, not demanding acknowledgement, not requiring celebration, simply being there. A warmth in the chest, a loosening in the shoulders, a breath that went all the way down and came all the way back up without catching anywhere on the way. She closed her eyes. With her eyes closed, the island became entirely sound and sensation. The cold of the rock beneath her, the pressure of the wind against her face, light and consistent, smelling of salt and depth and distance. The low, breathing sound of the sea all around her now, in every direction, no single source but a surround, an environment, a world of sound that was also a world of rhythm, rising and falling, rising and falling. The gannet below her was silent. The seabirds in the cliff crevices had grown entirely quiet now, tucked into their warm, dark hollows. Their breathing slowed, their small bodies resting against the ancient rock. The stars went on above her, though she could not see them now. She knew they were there. She could feel them. In whatever inexplicable way, the body sometimes feels the presence of very large things it cannot directly perceive. A faint, cool, sourceless light on her closed eyelids, a sense of enormous space above her, a sense of the sky being not a ceiling, but an opening, going up and out and on forever in every direction. She breathed in, long, full, all the way down. She breathed out, long, slow, all the way. The island held her. The sea breathed around her. The stars fell their ancient light on her face, steady and patient, and entirely without urgency. The light of things that had been shining long before she arrived and would go on shining long after she was gone. And in this, in the complete, beautiful indifference of it, she found the deepest rest she had found in a very long time. Not sleep, not yet, but the place just before sleep, the country at its border, the soft, dark, unhurried threshold where the mind begins to release its grip on the day, where the thoughts that have been circling begin to slow and drift and separate, where the body grows heavy in the best possible way. Not the heaviness of exhaustion or stress, but the heaviness of deep, genuine, well-earned rest. She was there. She was at the threshold. The island was quiet around her. The sea breathed on. Rest here a little longer on the island, in the dark. The stars are still falling their light on your face. The sea is all around you, very slow, very deep, very old, and you are here with it, small and warm and breathing. You can let go now. Everything is still. The island is holding you. The water is holding the island. The stars are holding everything. Let go, slowly, softly, all the way down. The ride home and the sound of sleep. Elinor walked back across the island slowly. There was no other way to walk it, really. Not at this hour, not in this dark, not after an evening that had asked so much of the body's capacity for stillness and receiving. She walked the way a person walks when they have been somewhere that has changed the interior weather of them, when the atmosphere of a place has moved through the skin and settled in the chest and the shoulders and the slow, unhurried rhythm of the breath. Not the walk of someone going somewhere, the walk of someone who has already arrived. Her footsteps on the island grass were very quiet. The grass received each step with that same soft, resilient give it had offered all evening, pressing briefly downward under her weight, and then rising again, returning to itself, leaving no lasting impression. She liked this about the island's grass. She liked that it did not hold the shape of her passing, that when she left, the island would return entirely to itself, unchanged, unaltered, as though she had never been there at all. There was something in this that was not melancholy, but its precise opposite, something freeing, something that removed from the evening any need for permanence, any pressure to make the experience mean something beyond itself. It had been enough to be here. That was all. It had simply been enough. She passed over the island's central ridge one final time, and at the top of it, she paused and turned in a slow circle, taking one last look in every direction. To the north, the dark coast, the lighthouse still counting its patient intervals of light. 1, 2, 3, and gone. 1, 2, 3, and gone. Steady and faithful as breathing. To the west, the open Atlantic, fully dark now, fully itself. The swells moving in their long procession from somewhere far beyond the horizon, arriving here and passing the island without slowing or acknowledging it, going on to whatever shore lay beyond. To the south, the lower edge of the island's land, the rock pools invisible in the dark, the sheltered water reflecting nothing. To the east, the mainland, the bridge, and beyond the bridge, the clifftop path, and beyond the path, the car park, and beyond the car park, the lane that would take her home. She did not linger in the east. she turned back to the west one more time and looked at the open sea for a long, unhurried moment. The sea did not look back. The sea had no need to. It was simply there, enormous and dark and breathing, going about the ancient, unceasing business of being the sea, which required nothing from her, and offered everything to her, and asked only that she stand at its edge and receive what it had to give. She received it. She breathed it in, and then she turned toward the east, toward the bridge, and began to walk. The bridge at night was a different thing from the bridge in the earlier evening. Then, when she had crossed it for the first time, there had still been enough of the evening's light to see the boards beneath her feet, and the ropes on either side, and the gap, and the water below, with something approaching clarity. Now there was only the dark, a soft, deep, textured dark through which the pale rope handrails were barely visible, and the boards beneath her feet were felt rather than seen, each one a slight change in the surface under her boots, a small announcement of itself as her weight came down on it. She moved more slowly than she had on the first crossing. Not out of fear, she was not afraid, but out of care, out of a kind of respect for the bridge and for the crossing, and for the fact that this was the last time tonight she would make it, and that last times deserved to be taken slowly, deserved to be felt with the full attention of a person who knows they are in the middle of something they will not be in the middle of again for a long time, or perhaps ever. Her hands on the rope handrails were firm, but not tight. She could feel the bridge moving beneath her and around her with that same gentle, living oscillation she had felt on the first crossing, the small, honest response of the structure to her weight and to the night wind that moved through the gap. It was a known feeling now, a familiar one, the bridge moving and her moving with it, and the water below in the dark, and the mainland ahead gradually resolving from dark to slightly less dark as she approached it. She stopped again in the middle. She had done this on the first crossing, stopped in the center, let go of one handrail, stood suspended between the island and the mainland with the water below and the stars above. She did it again now. She let go of the right handrail and let her right arm hang free at her side, and she stood in the dark in the middle of the bridge, in the middle of the gap, between the island and the land, and she listened. The sea below her was not visible, but she could hear it, the movement of the water in the channel beneath the bridge, that slightly different sound she had noticed on the first crossing. The water channeled and directed by the walls of rock on either side, moving with more purpose through the gap than it moved in the open water around the island. It had a low, rhythmic voice here, a kind of murmuring, not words, not language, but the sound of something fluid moving through something solid, the negotiation of water and rock expressed in sound, continuous and unhurried and entirely natural. She listened to it for a long moment. Then she reached for the rope again, wrapped her fingers around it, and walked the last boards to the mainland. Her feet found solid clifftop ground, and she stopped and stood still, adjusting. The adjustment from bridge to land, from the yielding, oscillating surface of the crossing to the absolute, unmoving certainty of the clifftop rock, happened in the body faster than the mind could follow it. One moment she was on the bridge, moving with its movement, accommodating its small live shifts. The next she was on the cliff, and the ground was not moving and would not move, and her body received this information and made its adjustments and settled, and she stood at the end of the bridge on solid ground and felt, for a moment, the mainland as though for the first time. How solid it was, how absolutely, incontrovertibly, unmovably solid. She pressed her feet down into it, feeling the rock through the soles of her boots, and found herself obscurely grateful for it, for the simple geological fact of it, the billions of years of compression and cooling and pressure that had produced this piece of ground on which she was standing, this reliable and patient surface that asked nothing and gave everything, and had been here, doing exactly this, since long before any living thing had thought to stand on it. She looked back at the island. It was barely visible now, a dark shape against a slightly less dark sea, its outline uncertain, its edges soft in the night air. The bridge she had just crossed was invisible entirely. Only the faint pale blur of the rope handrails at its near end, barely distinguishable from the general dark. The island itself was quiet. It gave nothing away. It was simply there, as it had been there all evening, as it would be there all night, as it would be there when she came back in daylight on some other visit, and found it looking entirely different, smaller, perhaps, or larger, or greener, or more dramatic, or more ordinary, and yet entirely itself. She looked at it for a long, still moment. Then she turned and began to walk back along the path toward the car park. The path at night felt different in both directions. Going out earlier in the evening, she had been walking toward something, toward the cliffs, toward the bridge, toward the island. The path had been full of anticipation, full of the particular energy of moving toward a place you have not yet reached. Coming back, the path was different, not less, not emptier, but differently full. Full of everything she was carrying away from the island. The cold, the stars, the gannet on its ledge, the seal's voice traveling across the dark water, the lighthouse counting in the north, the smooth stone still in her left jacket pocket, warming slowly against her thigh as she walked. The coastal grass on either side of the path moved in the night breeze with that same soft, papery sound she had noticed on the way out. It had not changed. The wind had not changed. The dark had only deepened. But she moved through it differently now, more slowly, more settled, her footsteps quieter, her breathing slower, the quality of her attention less outward and more inward, the evening turning gradually from an experience being had to an experience being held. She walked without a torch for the first part of the path. The starlight was sufficient, just sufficient, enough to make out the pale ribbon of the path between the darker grass on either side, enough to place each foot with reasonable confidence. Not enough for detail or distance, but enough for this, for the simple forward movement of a person on a known path going back to a known place. She walked in the dark and trusted the path, and the path received her trust and kept her and brought her along its length toward the car park with the same patient, unhurried fidelity with which it had brought her to the cliffs. When she reached the section of path that ran through the low coastal scrub, the heather and gorse she had passed through on the outward walk, she stopped and stood still for a moment, not for any particular reason, only because the stopping felt right, the way stopping always feels right in certain places at certain hours. The scrub around her was very still. The wind had dropped in the last little while, or perhaps been deflected here by the slight rise of the headland, and in its absence, the stillness was complete. She could hear nothing except the distant, continuous breathing of the sea, far enough away now, as she had come back from the cliff's edge, that it was a background sound again rather than a presence, a general quality of the air rather than something she was standing in the middle of. She looked up through the stillness at the stars. From here, lower than the cliff top, the sky was framed on two sides by the rounded shapes of the heather, dark, low, irregular. And the effect was of something almost like a room, the heather forming the walls and the sky forming the ceiling, the path the floor, a room without a roof, open to the stars, smelling of sea air, and the particular sharp sweetness of heather and gorse at night, which was a smell unlike any other, medicinal and wild, and faintly sweet all at once. The smell of something that has been growing in salt wind for a very long time and has become entirely adapted to it, entirely at ease in it. She stood in this open room for a minute. She breathed it in, the heather smell and the sea smell and the cold, clean air of the night, and she let it fill her completely, from the bottoms of her lungs upward, until she was full of it, all the way up, all the way to the top of her breath. Then she breathed it out, slowly all the way, and walked on. The car park, when she reached it, was as empty and quiet as she had left it, the dark green van still there, still muddy along its lower panels. Her own car sitting in the far corner of the gravel, its surfaces beaded with the fine condensation that had accumulated over the hours of her absence. The windscreen, a pale, slightly glimmering square in the dark. She walked to it across the gravel, the crunch of her footsteps familiar now, the sound of arrival and of departure, the sound of transition. She put her hand on the door handle, cold metal, damp, immediately recognizable, and paused before opening it. She turned and looked back the way she had come. The path was invisible, absorbed by the dark. The cliff's edge was invisible. The bridge was invisible. The island was invisible. There was no way from here at this angle, in this dark, to see it or know it was there except by memory and by the sound of the sea, which carried across the car park and the scrub and the low headland from the open water beyond, unchanged and unchanged and unchanged. She stood with her hand on the cold door handle and listened to it one last time. The sea, breathing, patient, old. She opened the door and got in. The interior of the car was cold, colder, she thought, than the outside air, having been closed and unheated all evening. The metal and glass having released whatever warmth it held into the dark around it and received nothing back. She sat in the cold interior and put her hands on the steering wheel and sat with them there, not yet starting the engine, not yet ready for the sound of the engine, which would be the first mechanical sound she had heard since she switched it off hours ago, and which would mark, irrevocably, the end of the island and the beginning of the journey home. She waited until she was ready. She sat in the cold car and looked through the condensation on the windscreen at the dark outside, and she breathed, and she held the evening in her chest, and she let it be what it was, complete, unhurried, fully itself, for one more minute. Then she started the engine. It turned over softly, a low, familiar sound, and the dashboard lights came on gentle amber and green in the dark interior. And the heater began to move cold air through the vents, which would become warm air in a few minutes. And Alina put the car in reverse and backed slowly out of the gravel parking space and turned onto the lane. The lane home was the same lane she had driven to the coast, and yet entirely different. The outward journey had been one of approach, of building, of the gradual narrowing of attention toward the sea and the island and the evening ahead. The return journey was the opposite, a gradual widening, a gradual softening, the tension of anticipation replaced by the deeper, quieter satisfaction of completion. She had been there. She had crossed the bridge. She had been on the island in the dark. She had heard the seal and counted with the lighthouse and held the smooth stone in her hand while the stars fell their ancient light on her face. She was carrying all of it back along this lane with her, in the way that places enter the body and become part of it, not as memories exactly, but as textures, as temperatures, as the particular quality of an evening that has been fully lived. She drove very slowly. The headlights cast their familiar cone of pale light down the lane. illuminating the hedgerows on either side in a moving panel of yellow-white. The leaves catching the light and releasing it as the car moved past. The lane ahead always vanishing into the dark, just beyond the reach of the beam. She drove with her hands loose on the wheel and the window down a little on her side. Just a little, just enough for the night air to continue arriving, cool and present and faintly salt. A last thread of connection to the coast she was leaving. The hedgerows whispered as she passed them. The lane curved and dipped and rose again with its same unhurried geography. The soft rain began somewhere between the coast and the first junction. She felt it before she saw it, a faint additional coolness on her cheek from the open window, a slight change in the texture of the air, the arrival of something fine and unhurried, more mist than rain, the kind of precipitation that does not announce itself with drops or sound, but simply appears, already present, already everywhere, as though it had been there all along and had only just decided to become visible. She wound the window up a little, not all the way, only enough to keep the interior dry, and turned the wipers on their slowest setting. They moved across the windscreen with a low, measured sound, a soft stroke to the right, a pause, a soft stroke back to the left, back and forth, back and forth. At this speed, at this slowness, the sound of the wipers was almost musical. Not music exactly, but rhythmic in the way that rhythmic things, heard late at night in a warm car on a quiet lane, become indistinguishable from comfort. She drove with the wipers moving, and the mist on the windscreen, and the dark hedgerows on either side, and the lane unfolding ahead of her one careful yard at a time. And she felt something she had been feeling for the whole of the evening settle more completely into her body. That deep, thorough, bone-level quiet that is the body's truest rest. The quietness that arrives not when you stop doing things, but when you stop needing to do things, when the evening has been full enough and good enough that there is nothing left wanting, nothing outstanding, nothing that still requires attention or effort or will. She was quite simply at peace. She passed the farmhouse. The lamp in the window was still burning. Of course it was. She had the irrational but entirely certain feeling that this lamp would burn all night, that it was the kind of lamp that burned always, that its warm amber light was as permanent a feature of this landscape as the stone wall with its moss, and the horses in the field, and the hedgerows, and the sea. She looked at it as she drove past, just briefly, just the moment of a glance, and she felt the same tenderness she had felt on the outward journey, the warmth toward the unknown life contained in that lit window. But deeper now, quieter, more settled. She drove past, and the farmhouse was gone behind her. The field where the horses had stood was dark and still. She slowed as she passed it and looked, but could not see them. They were somewhere in the dark of the field, invisible, sleeping, or standing sleeping in that deep, weighted way they had, their massive bodies resting on the earth, their eyes closed, their breathing slow and even and sufficient. She drove on. The lane rose toward the final low hill before the cottage, and at the top of it, Elinor slowed the car almost to a stop, as she had on the outward journey, and looked. Behind her now, to the north and west, though she could not see it from here, was the coast, the cliffs, the bridge, the island, the seal's voice traveling across dark water, the gannet on its ledge, white and still, the lighthouse counting softly in the north, the stars falling their ancient light on everything equally, on the rock and the water and the grass, and the cold rope handrails of the bridge, on the small oval stone in her pocket, on the short island grass that rose again after each footstep, as though she had never been there. She sat at the top of the hill and let the view settle. Then she drove down the other side and along the last stretch of lane to the cottage. The cottage was dark when she arrived. Of course it was. She had left it dark, had not thought to leave a light on, had not anticipated needing one. She parked in the gravel pull-in and turned the engine off and sat in the sudden silence, listening to the tick of the cooling engine and the very faint, very distant, entirely unchanged sound of the sea, still there, still breathing. She got out of the car slowly, feeling the cold of the night against her face. After the warmth, the car had finally managed to build in its interior, and she stood for a moment in the gravel beside the car and looked up at the sky. The stars were there above the cottage as they had been above the island, the same stars, the same Milky Way arching its broad, soft river across the dark, the same ancient light falling without preference on the gravel and the stone wall of the cottage, and the wet leaves of the hedge and the backs of her hands. The same, all of it the same, whether she was on the island or here, whether she was looking or not looking, whether anyone was here to receive it or not. The sky did not require an audience. The stars did not shine for her. They shone because that was what they did, because they had always done it and would always do it, long after this night, and this lane, and this small stone cottage had passed from any possible record. She stood in this and felt it fully. Then she went inside. The cottage interior was dark and cold. The cold of a small stone building that has been closed and unheated for several hours on a coastal night. She did not turn on the overhead light. She found the small lamp on the table near the window, the lamp whose warm amber glow she had seen from outside on other evenings, and switched it on. and the room came into being around her. The stone walls, the low ceiling, the simple wooden furniture, the rug on the flagstone floor, the window with the lane beyond it, and the dark beyond the lane. She stood in the lamplight for a moment, looking at the room. It was a very simple room. There was nothing in it that was not needed. There was nothing in it that announced itself or competed for attention. It was simply a room low and stone-built and warm-colored in the lamplight, and it was enough. It was, in fact, exactly enough. She took her jacket off and hung it on the hook by the door. She unwound her scarf and folded it over the back of the chair. She reached into her left pocket and took out the smooth, oval stone and held it for a moment in her palm, feeling its warmth, her warmth, transferred to it over the long walk and the drive home. And then she set it on the table beside the lamp, where it sat in the amber light and was simply what it was: a stone from the island, dark, smooth, certain. She poured a glass of water from the tap, cold, clean, tasting of nothing at all, and drank it slowly, standing at the kitchen counter, looking at nothing in particular. The sound of the water moving down her throat was a private, interior sound, the kind of sound you hear only when everything outside is quiet, and everything outside was quiet. The lane, the field, the distant sea. She rinsed the glass and set it upside down beside the sink. She moved through the cottage without turning on any other lights. The lamp in the front room casting enough warmth to see by, its light reaching through the doorways and settling in gentle, amber-edged pools on the floors of the other rooms. She moved through this light slowly and quietly, the way you move through a sleeping house, the way you move when you are very tired in the best possible way. When the tiredness is not the tiredness of strain or depletion, but the tiredness of fullness, of completion, of a day so completely and genuinely lived that the body has used everything it had and is ready, fully and without reservation, to rest. She sat on the edge of the bed and took her boots off, setting them neatly beside the door. She took the stone from her jacket pocket one more time. She had moved it without thinking and held it for a moment in the dark of the bedroom, feeling its weight, its smoothness, its oval certainty. She placed it on the small table beside the bed. Then she lay down. The bed received her the way a good bed receives a tired body, with a completeness that was almost audible, the give of it settling around her weight, the pillow receiving her head with a soft, unhurried finality. She pulled the blanket up to her chin. The blanket was heavy and warm, the weight of it on her body not pressing but present, the kind of weight that says simply, "You are here, you are covered, you are safe." She lay still. Through the window, she had not closed the curtains, had not wanted to, had wanted the sky to be there. Even from bed, she could see the stars. Just a small rectangle of sky, framed by the cottage window, holding perhaps 20 or 30 stars in its pale dark square. Not the full sky, not the island's sky, but enough. A reminder. A small, quiet, starlit window onto the same immensity that had been above her all evening, unchanged, patient, shining on. She looked at them for a while from the pillow. The room was cooling slowly around her. The small warmth the lamp had generated in the front room, not quite reaching the bedroom. The stone walls doing their honest, unhurried work of holding the night temperature within them. But beneath the blanket, she was warm. Her body had generated its own warmth, and the blanket was holding it. And within that warmth, she was entirely comfortable, entirely settled, her limbs growing heavier by degrees in that progressive, welcome way of a body finally, fully, completely at rest. She could hear the sea, very faintly, very distantly, not the immense, surrounding, full-bodied breathing she had heard on the island, standing above the cliffs with the water on all sides, but the sea nonetheless, a low, barely perceptible thread of sound threading through the silence of the cottage and the lane and the field and the dark, arriving at the window and the window letting it through, and the room holding it the way the room held the amber light from the lamp in the front room, gently, without effort, simply allowing it to be present, rising, falling, rising, falling, she thought briefly, without urgency, the thought arriving and resting, and beginning already to dissolve before it had fully formed of the island. It was out there in the dark. Right now, in this moment, as she lay in this bed in this room beneath this sky and listened to the distant breathing of the sea, the island was out there on the water, exactly as it had been when she was on it, and exactly as it had been before she arrived, and exactly as it would be tomorrow when the light came back, and the morning came in off the sea, and the grass caught the first of it, and the gannet lifted from its ledge, and spread those long, angular wings, and rose into the clean morning air without effort, without strain, simply because the wind was there, and the wings were there, and the rising was what came next. The island was there, the sea was there, the stars were there, the lighthouse was there, counting its patient intervals of light in the north. 1, 2, 3, and gone. 1, 2, 3, and gone. Whether anyone was counting with it or not, all of it was there, and she was here in this bed, in this room, beneath this small rectangle of star-filled sky, and the distance between here and there was not a distance that diminished either. The island was complete without her. She was complete without the island, and yet the evening they had shared, the hours of dark and cold and silence and starlight, and the seal's voice on the water, and the gannet's white stillness, and the rope bridge moving under her hands, that was something neither of them would carry in any form she could point to, and yet that was real. as real as the stone on the table beside her, as real as the weight of the blanket, as real as the distant, barely audible, endlessly patient breathing of the sea. Her eyes grew heavy, not suddenly, gradually, the way all the best things arrive, without announcement, without drama, settling over her slowly and completely, the way the dark had settled over the evening, the way the cold had settled into the rock, the way the sea had settled into its night breathing. Her eyes grew heavy. She let them close. The room was warm and dark and still. The stone on the table beside her was smooth and oval and certain. The stars were in the window. The sea was in the air, and the sound of it, that low, ancient, endlessly patient rising and falling, moved through the room and through the walls and into her body, and settled there in the deep, warm center of her, and carried her gently, softly, without effort and without end, all the way into sleep. Herb, you are home now. The blanket is warm and heavy. The stars are in the window. The sea is in the air all around you, rising, falling, rising, falling. The island is out there in the dark, quiet and complete, resting on the water. The lighthouse is counting softly far away. 1, 2, 3, and gone. 1, 2, 3, and gone. Your breath is slow. Your body is warm. Your eyes are closed. There is nothing left to do, nothing left to hold. The evening is complete. The night is full. The sea is breathing. And you are drifting now, very gently, very softly, further and further from the day, deeper and deeper into the quiet, into the dark, into the warm, still, endless comfort of sleep. Rest now, rest completely. The sea is holding everything, and everything is still.